Welcome everybody to today's webinar, Tackling Fossil Fuel Subsidies in British Columbia. My name is Tzeporah Berman. I'm the International Program Director at Stand.earth, and I'll be your moderator for today. Before I begin, I want to recognize that I'm speaking to you from the unceded territory of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. So today's webinar is going to cover what exactly are fossil fuel subsidies, what are the biggest ones in British Columbia. We're going to be looking at the BC NDP commitment to review the oil and gas royalty framework and why that's important, how subsidies contribute to the expansion of LNG in the province, how subsidies contribute to pollution and climate change, and what this means for competing clean energy if there's a potential to kickstart a green economy and better recovery from COVID-19 if government money is, well, actually our money is used wisely. So earlier this fall, Stand.earth released a report entitled Subsidizing Climate Change, How BC Gives Billions to Corporate Polluters, with the goal of making fossil fuel subsidies an issue that politicians had to respond to and highlight that fracking and LNG are not viable in this province without the province giving the industry massive tax breaks and direct subsidies. What we found was shocking. I think I, like many of you, had an expectation that this government would prioritize your money and mine, taxpayers' dollars, to ensuring that we build solutions, especially at this critical moment in our history when we're already experiencing the impacts of climate change in our daily lives. What we found is that BC has the second highest fossil fuel subsidies in Canada. Only Jason Kenney, lead Alberta, and Alberta spend more to prop up this industry. Under Premier Horgan's government, fossil fuel subsidies have increased by 79%. In 2020, BC will spend just under $1 billion of taxpayers' money on fossil fuel subsidies. That's twice what the province spent on CleanBC. It's planned to fight climate change. It's 4 times what the province gets back from the oil and gas royalties. So let's dig into these issues. I want first to note that this webinar is being recorded. Also to let you know that there is a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. As questions come up for you as you hear from our amazing panel, please put your questions in that. We're going to have time to have a conversation and take your questions after we hear from each of our speakers. And also, if you are on social media right now and would like to further this conversation, please use the hashtag #StopFossilSubsidies. And also, let's make sure BC decision makers hear about this conversation too. So let's use the hashtag BCPOLI, BCPOLI. Okay, let's get into it. Our first speaker is Vanessa Corkal. She is a policy analyst at the International Institute for Sustainable Development in Ottawa, where she focuses on fossil fuel subsidies and just transition. Last year, she wrote the report Locked In and Losing Out, which quantified subsidies in British Columbia. Vanessa, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Tzeporah, and hello everyone. It's great to see so much interest in this topic. My name is Vanessa Corkal. I work on the unceded territories of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe Nation, otherwise known as Ottawa. I am going to share my screen and do a slideshow so I can dig into some of the thorny technical stuff about subsidies before my colleagues take it up with some broader questions. So just give me a second here. And if someone could confirm this is working, that would be great. Perfect. Okay. So first off, I wanted to talk about what do we mean when we talk about fossil fuel subsidies and what exactly are those? We see these terms kind of thrown around a lot in the media, but actually, you know, there is a slight difference between subsidies and support. So if you can think of this as a big circle, subsidies are kind of the core of this issue. Subsidies are part of an agreed upon definition under the World Trade Organization agreements that Canada has signed on to. There are international methodologies to measure them as part of measuring against the Sustainable Development Goals. And Canada has a commitment as part of the G20 to phase out inefficient fossil fuel subsidies by 2025. Mainly, subsidies consist of direct spending and tax breaks, but they do take other forms as well. However, there's a much broader way in which governments support the fossil fuel sector. So when we use the term support, that also encompasses other things. So it could be subsidies, it could be public finance, state-owned enterprises, and other types of support. But ultimately, we want to be phasing all of this out as we move towards a low carbon economy. So here also you can see there's different types of ways that governments support fossil fuels, from budget expenditures and tax expenditures. And also at the widest end of the circle, you may hear a term called externalities. So externalities are the costs associated with climate change, with pollution, with the health costs related. All of these things are extremely costly. And while these are not technically subsidies under the WTO definition, these costs also need to be considered when we're talking about the rationale for government spending on fossil fuels. So why are we trying to reform subsidies? Well, they're expensive, they incentivize pollution, and they disadvantage clean energy by distorting markets. There's two main types of subsidies. The first are those that make producing fossil fuels cheaper, so that incentivize fossil fuel production and expansion. The vast majority of subsidies in BC are for fossil fuel production. The second category is for consumption, which makes using fossil fuels cheaper, not just by individuals, but also by companies. And although you may hear a lot about subsidies for affordable household energy, the reality is that these are only a very small portion of existing subsidies in BC and Canada, and that most subsidies are actually production subsidies or consumption subsidies for industry. And lastly, some common myths that you may hear in the media as well. First, that money that reduces greenhouse gas emissions is not a subsidy. Unfortunately, this money still lowers the cost of business for fossil fuel producers, so this is still technically a subsidy, especially under the World Trade Organization definition. Second, the tax breaks and royalty relief don't qualify as subsidies. Again, under the WTO definition, which is internationally agreed upon, these are subsidies. And lastly, that removing subsidies would be harmful because it means that you'd be advocating for job losses and energy insecurity. Here, actually, we'd like to say that subsidy reform can help us transition to clean energy, create jobs, and enhance energy security. So where are we now in BC? So this is the report that we published last year, and as Tzeporah mentioned, Stand.earth has updated figures in their most recent report. When we did ours, we found at least 830 million in 2017 to 18. But it's important to note that not all of the subsidies we actually were able to quantify because there isn't full transparency from government on some of the measures that exist. But I am going to break down some of the biggest ones here so you can get a sense of where some of this money is going. So the biggest type of subsidy that we see in BC are what's called royalty credits and reductions. So for those of you that aren't familiar with royalties, essentially royalties are there when there's private development of a public resource. Mining is a classic example of this, where governments are supposed to collect royalties and have that support government spending in areas to provide goods and services to the population. So royalty credit or reduction reduces how much money government is able to receive. Most commonly in BC, we see that royalty credits exist for deep drilling and fossil fuel production infrastructure. So this was almost $350 million last year. The tricky thing about these is that producers can also bank them. So they don't have to use them all in the year they get them. They can bank them for future years. And right now we have at least $2.6 billion in outstanding credits that producers will be able to use in the future. So here you can see a list of the type of credits and reductions that exist in BC. Not all of these we have full information on to see how much money they each represent. However, there's also other types of subsidies. Even last year in the 2019 budget, the BC government allocated around $20 million in direct support for gas and LNG infrastructure. There's also a slew of tax breaks for aviation, agricultural fuels, marine shipping, rail, mining tax provisions, and other tax breaks. And these ones are also tricky because many other provinces, in fact, most Canadian provinces have similar tax breaks. So we really need to figure out how Canadian provinces at large, including BC, can move away from these kinds of tax breaks towards systems that still make things affordable for people, but also move us away from harmful fossil fuels. And then this is the big one, and one that my colleagues will talk more about. BC and the federal government have signed a memorandum of understanding last year on how to provide electricity support for fossil fuel production, specifically LNG. In this memorandum of understanding, they committed to spend up to $680 million on electrification. There's also the 20-year term BC LNG Canada agreement, which was signed last year as part of the LNG Canada's decision to actually invest in their project. So this is locking in certain subsidies for 20 years. And what's tricky about it is that it sets an important precedent, because other LNG companies theoretically could also ask the provincial government for similar agreements and create a situation in which we lock ourselves into subsidies in the exact same moment that we should be moving away from them. So just a brief comparison to Stand.earth's report that they recently released, where they found that BC spent $484 million last year on reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And if you can compare that to the at least $830 million, if not more, on subsidies, this is a pretty stark comparison. So especially since we've seen this trend is that subsidies are growing in recent years. And just a quick reality check of where we actually need to move away from. You may have seen the UN Secretary General speech for the state of the planet of just a few days ago, where he talked about the suicidal war on nature that we are waging as humans. And I think it's pretty clear, and he's made it very clear in many of his speeches, that it's time to phase out fossil fuel finance and end fossil fuel subsidies. This can start at home, not just by the federal government, but by provincial governments like BC. And with that, I will pass it on to our Tzeporah and our next speaker. Thanks.
Fantastic. Thanks, Vanessa. That was a lot of information in a short period of time. For folks who aren't monitoring the chat, the reports that Vanessa mentioned, the links are right in the chat. We will also be making a recording of this event available later for your future reference. I'm really glad you brought in the speech a couple of days ago from the UN, and I think it's also important to note that just a couple of days before, there was the release of the production gap report. We'll put the link in the chat for that as well. But what the production gap report noted is that governments globally are currently on track to produce 120% more fossil fuels than can be burned under a 1.5 degree scenario. And the report calls for an immediate reduction in production of oil, gas, and coal. So here in BC, we're constantly hearing that the expansion of fracking and LNG is consistent with our climate targets, but globally the conversation has moved on to reducing expansion of oil, gas, and coal in order to fight climate change. So a couple of really important reports out of the UN just this week. We're going to move on now to our next speaker. We have Marc Lee. Marc is a senior economist with the British Columbia Office of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. As part of his work with CCPA and the Corporate Mapping Project, Marc has investigated tax breaks and subsidies for LNG. So Marc, over to you.
Great, thanks so much, Tzeporah, and thank you, Vanessa, and thanks to all the organizers for having me on this panel. I don't have pretty slides like Vanessa had to share with you, but I do have this backdrop, which is a photograph that I took this summer because I did a tour of northern BC and the Yukon. And in addition to seeing all of the beautiful stuff, I did a bunch of industrial tourism. So what you're looking at behind me is the LNG Canada facility in Kitimat and the modular housing that has been constructed for the temporary workforce that is building the plant. I wasn't actually able to get close enough to see the actual construction of the physical plant itself. I'm not even sure how much is there, but the so-called man camps up there now racing with COVID are a big part of the landscape down by the port of Kitimat. So thanks again for having me here. I think what's interesting about the conversation around subsidies is that in many ways, this is old BC industrial policy. For going back many decades, the British Columbia government has sought to provide various supports for resource extraction. So low rates from BC Hydro in particular are one of those. And you could argue that the creation of BC Hydro in the 1960s was, in fact, in large part about providing cheap electricity to the resource sector. Even the development of pipeline and gas infrastructure in British Columbia was started by the provincial government. It was a public corporation, BC Gas, that was then privatized in the 1980s. So what's interesting as well about the LNG conversation is that if you roll back the clock to 2012 and 2013, the promise of LNG was that it was going to, it didn't need any subsidies. In fact, it would be the opposite, that there'd be this massive windfall to the people of British Columbia. What we heard from then Premier Christy Clark was 100,000 jobs, $1 billion in new GDP, and $100 million of new revenues going to the provincial government, which would allow us to build new schools and hospitals and cut taxes and do all kinds of great things. All of that was predicated on a temporarily high price in Japan and other Asian countries, largely stemming from the nuclear accident in Fukushima, Japan, and some other nuclear irregularities in South Korea. So there, for a few years there was a major price premium for taking gas in British Columbia and exporting it and selling it in Asia. But that all fell apart fairly quickly. And now we are in the situation we are looking at essentially providing subsidies for the sector. So Vanessa already talked about the main ones on the side of fracking and extracting the resource in the northeast of BC. And then I'm looking more at the LNG side. So the LNG Canada terminal in Kitimat and any others that may emerge in the future, including wood fiber near Squamish. There's a Fortis Tilbury expansion that's being planned also for the Lower Mainland. So the main subsidies, again, starting with BC Hydro, the reason this is a subsidy is because we're essentially increasing the demand and increasing the supply of electricity in British Columbia, but there's a mismatch there, that the price that the LNG companies are going to be paying for this new electricity we're creating is only about half the cost of creating that energy in the first place. Some of these costs are yet to be determined in the case, for example, of Site C, so that half of the cost was predicated on Site C at a lower budget than we are currently anticipating with the various cost overruns we're seeing on the site right now. And so in addition to the public sector building Site C and building transmission infrastructure to connect the oil and gas industry to so-called clean energy, this is another sort of a way that we kind of subsidize the industry through BC Hydro, and all ratepayers in British Columbia, where residential, commercial, and other industries are going to have to pay higher rates eventually as a result of these investments in areas where there's really no other demand for that electricity. Second subsidy is around the carbon tax. So BC has a carbon tax. The new NDP government, when it came in 3 years ago, announced new increases to the carbon tax. So under the previous Gordon Campbell regime, it had topped out at about $30 per ton, which works out to about 7 cents per liter at the pump. If you're to put it in more human terms. And we are on a schedule now to get up to $50 per ton, which is basically in line with what the federal government is proposing. So for LNG, the government is essentially exempting LNG Canada from the incremental carbon tax above $30 per ton. It's predicated on the idea that LNG Canada will meet some world-leading benchmark in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. But LNG Canada has not committed to use electricity for its drives. It's going to be burning its gas. So there's a chance it may be more efficient than some of its comparators around the world. But in terms of like any kind of world-leading benchmark in greenhouse gas emissions, that's not really going to happen. So the BC Hydro subsidy to LNG Canada is worth about $30 to $60 million per year. That amount will go up if other LNG projects come on board. The carbon tax exemptions are worth about $62 million per year once it gets up and running. In addition to that is a break on corporate income taxes. So the intent is essentially to lower the tax rate that will be paid by LNG Canada and other facilities from 12% down to 9%. There's a deferral on provincial sales tax. So there's about $600 million in PST that would be paid during the construction of the LNG Canada facility. And essentially what the government is doing here is giving LNG Canada an interest-free loan. But it works out to about $22 million per year in value. There are other concessions as well. And like I said, Vanessa already talked about the main royalty credits for fracking. But one of the main proponents in the LNG Canada consortium is Petronas from Malaysia, and they own a lot of upstream gas assets. So there's a long-term royalty agreement that the Liberal government, BC government signed with them that actually locks in a lower schedule of royalties than would normally be paid. So again, even we're lowering the baseline in terms of royalties to expect. And then there's the credits that would be applied on top of that. So it's likely its operation will pay very, very little upstream for the gas that it extracts. And finally, not a BC subsidy, but the federal government is also providing subsidies by exempting from tariffs the imported steel modules that will essentially form the LNG Canada facility itself. These would normally be subject to tariffs, but we are exempting them, and that's worth about $1 billion as well. So all of these things need to be eliminated in any kind of framework for winding down the fossil fuel industries in British Columbia. What they are doing is they are making activities which would otherwise be uneconomic into things that are economic because of the subsidies. So in a sense, they're subsidizing to create a small amount of jobs and increase our total GDP. So final comment, I just want to link back to something Tzeporah said around the international dimension of this, and Vanessa mentioned externalities. So the costs that are imposed on third parties now and into the future by taking all of this carbon that's kind of safely sequestered underground in British Columbia and releasing it into the atmosphere. Most of that won't get counted in BC's greenhouse gas emission totals. It'll get counted wherever it's burned in China or Japan or Korea, or what have you. But it's a fairly substantial amount when you look at it. And if you add sort of a very conservative estimate of the costs associated with putting that carbon into the atmosphere, it's easily $5 to $10 billion per year in damages that are being created by BC carbon being released into the atmosphere through this chain of fracking, LNG exports, and final combustion. So, I mean, there's a saying that, if we don't change direction, we're going to end up where we're headed. And I think this is one of those times, in particular with a new BC government, a review of oil and gas royalties, and some impetus to boost up their CleanBC plan. But it's going to be a fight. I think there's a battle at the soul of this provincial government, some of which are anchored in that old resource extraction mentality. And there are others who believe in climate action and the benefits that can come of that. And we need to support the second, not the first. Thanks so much.
Wow, fantastic, Marc. Thank you so much. Those are some pretty shocking statistics. I remember when I was reading the oil, gas, and the climate report that came out last year in Madrid from the Global Gas and Oil Network. And, we hear a lot in Canada about how, it's other countries are the big problem. And that report showed that 85% of the planned expansion of oil and gas globally is in 4 jurisdictions: Alberta, British Columbia, Texas, and New Mexico. So that's 85% of global planned expansion of oil and gas. So we are sitting on a lot of potential carbon emissions at the exact moment in history when the whole world's trying to figure out how to reduce carbon emissions. And that's an important part of this story. So I'm going to turn now to our next speaker. We have Kai Nagata. Kai is the communications director at Dogwood. a grassroots citizens group here in British Columbia. He helps run campaigns to stop the use of taxpayers' dollars going to fossil fuels, including a campaign in the recent BC election to stop fossil fuel subsidies, which, as we've heard, got a promise out of the NDP government. Kai, over to you.
Thanks, Tzeporah. Thanks for having me today. So I'm speaking to you from Gitxsan territory in northern BC. I actually live on Kirby's dad's family's house territory here near Hazelton, BC. And just down the road in the village here, we have our first confirmed COVID cases. And as predicted, they came from industrial work sites. They came from the big man camps here in northern BC. And if you travel around, just to paint a little bit of a picture, from Kitimat and Terrace, where Kirby is today, east to Houston and then on to Prince George and down to North Thompson, it's really hard to exaggerate the pace and scale of industrial development that we're seeing with both the Trans Mountain and Coastal GasLink pipelines under construction and LNG Canada. So we're talking about highways just crawling with big white trucks with flags in the back and slip tanks, many of them with Alberta license plates. And the motels, if you drive through northern BC right now, the motels are just crammed with contractors, work trucks from, again, mostly from Alberta. And if you go along the pipeline routes, you'll see active tree clearing, stockpiles, you know, a lot of men and equipment in motion, and a lot of that is being fueled by BC taxpayers. It's being fueled with our money, and the reason that it is happening at this scale and the reason that these companies can project profitability decades into the future is because they're underwritten by us. And so I have bad news today and I have good news. And the bad news is that the numbers are moving in the wrong direction. And these companies are very good at finding new ways to siphon public money out of governments and into the pockets of their executives and shareholders. And so it's a little bit like whack-a-mole. We're not just talking, of course, as Vanessa said, about traditional subsidies under the WTO definition. We're talking about all these new forms of support which have flourished under COVID. And so just as an example, this week we found out that Imperial Oil received $120 million in emergency wage subsidies from the federal government, but they never stopped paying their dividend to shareholders. So investors in Imperial Oil are still getting their check every month, while the Canadian taxpayer essentially funnels that money through the company and out to those investors. And so, you know, we're constantly on this hamster wheel, finding out about new measures by crown corporations and branches of the government to loan money and give money and siphon money off to these companies. And so it can feel very daunting when you add all of that up and you look at how quickly we need to reduce emissions and wind this industry down, and how badly the government's priorities are out of whack. The good news is that the more people find out about this, the angrier they get. This is a political landmine. It's politically toxic for precisely the reason that people are suffering. Everyday people are desperate for investments in healthcare, in basic security and housing, schools, hospitals, and these things are being starved. We're told that there isn't enough money and we're in deficit, and we are going to be dealing with a wave of post-COVID austerity, while at the same time our governments are shoveling billions of dollars out the door into oil and gas companies. And so the more people hear about this, the angrier they get. And so we've done some polling nationally on Trans Mountain, and it's intuitive, but it's nice to confirm that the higher the price tag goes on this pipeline, the more billions of dollars that Canadians have to pile into this very uncertain, very risky, money-losing project, which also happens to violate Indigenous rights and jeopardize the climate, the higher opposition grows as well. And so people who may have accepted the government's arguments a couple of years ago about how Trans Mountain and the climate can work together, something hand in hand, it's all going to work out, when they're told that they're the ones paying for it and the price tag keeps going up, they reverse their support. And the same thing provincially, where, you know, we talked to a couple thousand BC NDP donors during the recent election campaign, and they have very little awareness. They don't know the fact that subsidies have gone up under the Horgan government. They're not aware of the numbers, but when you tell them, they get really, really mad. And the opposition, especially among progressive voters, the people that keep electing the federal Liberals and the BC NDP, is very, very high. And so there's a disconnect. And these governments are approaching a point where they're going to have to decide between the values of their own supporters and, you know, continuing to serve the bottom line of these international oil and gas companies. And so I think that there's a real opportunity here to help build that public awareness. And I think this webinar is a great example. We also need to start shifting the narrative in the media. We need to get more news stories comparing the public investments, the public subsidies and support for fossil fuels with the other things that we're told are important, like climate action. And hearing things like, you know, the government spent twice as much money in BC last year on fracking subsidies as it did on CleanBC, that's hair-raising, that's shocking. And more people need to know that. And so raising awareness, talking to friends and family, organizing at that grassroots level, helping to shift the media narrative, and ultimately taking that back to decision makers. I think that's going to be really important over this next couple of years. It's a crucial pivot point in the climate fight. And I think this is the first domino in really starting to get a grip on climate change. And it should be the easiest because of the amount of public support for removing subsidies and financial support from taxpayers to oil and gas companies. So we have a petition in BC that we can pop into the chat. Dogwood has launched a Stop Fossil Fuel Subsidies petition here in BC. And I think there's other opportunities that are going to come up around these individual mega projects. You know, there's lots of different fronts in this battle, but they all point back to the same fundamental problem, which is that our governments are prioritizing the profits of international oil and gas companies over the well-being of people in BC and our future in a safe, climate-safe world. So lots of opportunities. Excited to hear from you in the Q&A, but I'll leave it there and pass it off to Kirby.
Thanks so much, Kai. You have simultaneously answered a whole bunch of questions that I'm already seeing in the Q&A, so that was awesome. Please continue to add your questions to the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. We're going to be getting to all of those questions shortly. And let's continue the conversation. Many of you are already active on social media, and specifically on Twitter. If you're using Twitter, please use the hashtag #StopFossilSubsidies and also BC Poly to continue this conversation. Next, we have Kirby Muldoe. Kirby is the Indigenous engagement worker for Skeena Wild Conservation Trust based in Terrace, BC. Earlier this year, he took part in a report published by Human Rights Watch called "My Fear is Losing Everything: The Climate Crisis and First Nations Right to Food in Canada." The report identifies fossil fuel subsidies as contributing to pollution and climate change and as a barrier to better supporting First Nations rights to food and of the ability to manage climate change. Kirby, over to you.
Thank you, Tzeporah. Can you hear me? Can everybody hear me?
We can.
Good. Okay. Good afternoon. My ancestral name is Hup Wil Lax A. I am from the Tsimshian and Gitxsan people. I come to you today from Hazelton, which is in Gitxsan territory. The climate crisis and Indigenous people's right to food in Canada is at the forefront for Indigenous food security proponents. In many cases, our Indigenous communities are suffering from food insecurity. Up to 50% of Indigenous households battle food insecurity. Up to 70% of the Indigenous diet is made up of salmon and other wild foods. Over my short lifetime, I've witnessed many of the impacts of climate change, pollution, and the negative impacts of industrial activity. The negative impacts of the fossil fuel industry are felt by Indigenous communities the most. The subsidies awarded to these industries is a slap in the face to Indigenous peoples who are suffering from food insecurity, especially when many of those communities don't even have safe drinking water. Climate change seriously impacts the ability of Indigenous individuals and communities to access and harvest their traditional foods. I was involved with a report recently released by Human Rights Watch, which documents this impact, not just in BC, but in Ontario and the Yukon. This report shows how climate change is causing greater food insecurity and impacting Indigenous health. From unpredictable extreme weather events to the degradation of natural habitat for wildlife, the impacts are immense. I was sitting and talking to an elder one day, and I said, we have to do everything we can to save the environment and the planet. And the elder looked at me and said, the planet's going to be just fine, with or without us. We must do everything we can to save ourselves and those who cannot speak our languages. We must speak for them. The elder went on to say, we have the right to harvest our food, but more importantly, we must take very seriously our obligation to our descendants, that they have the ability to harvest and live a healthy life as we and our ancestors did. In my short time with you today, I will tell you of what I have witnessed, what I have heard from my ancestors, and what I've heard from friends who have witnessed firsthand the impacts of climate change. I will also provide some ideas and solutions at the end for your consideration. As a young boy, I often went fishing to provide food for my mother, father, and siblings. I witnessed thousands of salmon passing by as I sat on the shores of the Kispiox and Skeena rivers. Those days are but a distant memory. I can only tell the stories of when the salmon were plentiful. I've heard stories of when a person could literally walk across the backs of the salmon in the river. They were so plentiful. I can only tell the stories of when the moose and the deer were in great numbers as well. I used to go fishing with my grandfather in Prince Rupert. He was this commercial fisherman. We used to catch salmon by the thousands daily. But when we go fishing in Prince Rupert today, we're lucky to catch 100 in a few days, and it takes an immense amount of resources and energy. The salmon that feed many Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities and economies is at great risk. The fossil fuel industry and climate change have had many impacts on the salmon. Greenhouse gases and emissions from the fossil fuel industry has contributed to global warming. Global warming, in turn, contributes to a decrease in the number of salmon. As warmer waters make it harder for them to breathe, muddy water from landslides and extreme rain events also increasing thanks to climate impacts makes it harder for them to breathe and reproduce as well. Salmon are very sensitive to temperature, as are many other plants and animals on the planet. Warmer oceans mean less food for the salmon as they begin to become adults in the North Pacific. Warmer oceans also mean a greater ability for disease and parasites to thrive. Salmon returns are smaller in numbers and in physical size and nutritional value. As salmon begin to return to their place of birth and spawning grounds, the demand for what little salmon are left rises and the supply numbers diminish. This is not a story that is unique to the Skeena River watershed. I've heard stories from our neighbors to the south in the Fraser River watershed, where many have not been able to access food fishery for many years because of low returns. The impacts the fossil fuel industry and climate change have on our natural resources is extraordinary. Many Indigenous communities in Canada do not have clean drinking water, where industrial activity merely miles from their home communities is destroying clean drinking water. While governments provide subsidies to those destructive fossil fuel industries, they will not provide the resources for those communities to access clean drinking water. Access is one of our biggest concerns. Access to our traditional hunting and harvesting territories has been impacted. On many occasions, industries have moved into our ancestral hunting and gathering sites and has thus denied us the entry to practice our hunting and gathering right in those territories. I've heard many stories from our neighbors to the north who have said that because of flooding and drought conditions, they can no longer access their traditional hunting and gathering sites to harvest caribou and fish from the rivers and lakes. Rivers and lakes no longer freeze over, and I've also heard stories of creeks, rivers, and lakes completely drying up. Extreme and unpredictable weather events caused by global warming has a very serious impact on our ability to harvest and the ability of plants to reproduce Berries and traditional medicines are impacted by extreme weather events. Drought conditions and flooding causes berries and plants extreme stress and thus the inability to thrive. 2 summers ago, we experienced drought conditions in the Skeena where salmon were being trapped in pools and they could not escape, thus dying and drying up. Many salmon could not get to their place of origin and spawning grounds due to this drought. Salmon have a very difficult time in droughts. Their habitat is very small, water is warm, they're easy prey for predators, and they have very little spawning area. Extreme flooding makes it very hard for salmon to return to their spawning grounds. It also contributes to eggs being washed away and or covered by silt, resulting in the inability to survive. Also contributing to low numbers of salmon production. Habitat destruction is also of great concern. Clearing rivers and streams of their shade trees and deep pool loss as a result of flooding has a huge impact on the ability of salmon to survive. Building roads, diverting rivers and streams has lethal impacts on salmon. Wildfires are more prevalent these days. Global warming and fossil fuel industries contribute to these events. The fires destroy hundreds of thousands of hectares of timber, more and more every year, and the fires are more extreme, bigger, and growing in numbers. Wildfires kill thousands of animals, displace them, and cause a great amount of stress for those that survive. The stress on people is great as well. Breathing problems, loss of property, and displacement is ongoing. Climate change also impacts our economies. As I said earlier, I used to be a commercial fisher. There were hundreds of us on the waters making a good living. Now there are but a few. Tourism has been a constant form of economy in many communities, and especially in the Skeena. Hotels, fish guides, sports stores, restaurants, and the list goes on, depend on wild salmon and a healthy environment for a healthy economy. The fossil fuel industries and the subsidies that governments are giving to them is contributing to the loss of habitat and the downfall of many of our economies that have been here for decades. And for what? An industry that's shrinking. I know I may not be very popular for saying this, but if I don't say it, who will? Many of us will die as a result of climate change, food insecurity, and starvation. It's already happening in parts of the world. It's coming. What are we going to do about it? I urge you to ask your elected officials this very important question. Here are some of the solutions I've come up with, some suggestions as to where the money could be better spent, and I'm sure others will have ideas as well. Let's spend this money on greener, resilient economies. Bring back rejuvenation to the land, water, and air. Let's create local, sustainable economies for each community so that parents don't have to leave their families to go into industrial man camps to find work. Tourism is an economy that will last forever if we embrace it and protect it. Let's refit all the houses in Canada that need to be more energy efficient, creating tens of thousands of jobs for years to come. Most importantly, let's use this money to bring safe drinking water to those communities that do not have access now. Build facilities for those communities to be self-sufficient. Let's finally address food insecurity by investing in community projects, support traditional harvesting, protecting the land and waters that sustain us. Thank you.
Wow, Kirby, my hand's up to you for sharing those stories, and also for your leadership in the creative solutions that you have brought forward around where we could be spending this money and how we could pivot to a more resilient economy. So questions have been flowing in. Thank you all. I don't know if you can see this. I can. We have well over 200 people, 262 people right now on the webinar from across British Columbia. So really appreciate all of you taking your time today to listen to these folks and to learn about these critical issues. We're going to start with the questions now, and so keep them coming in. I'm going to ask Vanessa, A number of the questions relate to these definitions, and it's something that's bothered me, for years. Because often when I meet with industry or government, industry will say, "Well, we don't get subsidies." Various levels of government will say, "Oh, those numbers are way overblown. We don't really do subsidies." But yet, when I read your very detailed reports, as you mentioned, you're using the WTO definitions. So why this confusion, and what do they mean when they say we don't get subsidies?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, that's why I wanted to start this webinar from the get-go to kind of explain what does that term mean. If I can step back I mentioned that Canada, as a G20 country, agreed to phase out inefficient fossil fuel subsidies as part of an agreement back in 2009. So that's over a decade ago. There was a couple tricky things about that. First is they put in this word inefficient to make sure that all the G20 countries would actually sign on. So we run into a lot of problems because each government has decided to define inefficient in its own way. And a lot of governments will take the tack that, if something's creating economic gains, it must be efficient. And in fact, at the federal level, the Auditor General of Canada found that Canada had not adequately considered the environmental and the social impacts of subsidies when they were looking at efficient. But when it comes to subsidies more broadly, there is this international definition, but ultimately, when Canada does its peer review and when governments identify subsidies on their own, ultimately it's up to the government to figure out which definition they're going to use. So at IISD, we always encourage and work with governments to try to get them to use international standards to make sure there's a level playing field and to actually tackle the full scale of the problem, because you can debate the merits of a subsidy, right? For example, subsidies that allow communities to have affordable energy, that's not necessarily something you want to get rid of overnight. That might be something you want to phase out over time as you introduce clean energy. But it doesn't mean that you shouldn't include that subsidy in an inventory. So getting the definition right is key, because we need to have a full list of all the subsidies that are out there so that we can figure out an action plan of how we're going to phase them out and move to a more effective system. And unfortunately in Canada, there has been a lot of pushback against these definitions and a lot of confusion that's been sown from different organizations or groups that have perhaps conflicting motivations. But I think it's important to remember the big picture goals, which is, as a global community, we need to be tackling climate change. And it's clear that fossil fuel subsidies are not compatible with climate change action. And from that, we need to be identifying all these subsidies and calling them what they are so that we can figure out how to best deal with them.
Fantastic. Thank you. Marc, I want to ask you, I think we've all seen the reports that are kind of every day now coming out. The Institute for Energy Economy and Finance out of New York, Carbon Tracker out of London. We're seeing that oil and gas companies are now operating at the bottom of the S&P. There's more bankruptcies in oil and gas than any other sector. We've seen a lot of analysis out of countries that got there ahead of us on LNG, that their LNG is not doing as well as they thought. And Carbon Tracker has even said that they think big new LNG and fracking plays will become stranded assets in the future. So we keep hearing that the subsidies are necessary to support the economy, but the market trends don't look good. And so can you explain what's going on there from an economic perspective? Like, are these subsidies propping up the LNG projects? Like, can the LNG projects go ahead without them? And if they can't, then by propping them up, how long do we need to keep propping them up? What's the future look like?
Yeah, great question. I mean, the economics of this is so important. I mean, I think the first part is that 15 years ago, before fracking became a widespread technology, the baseline assumption in North America was that we were running out of gas. So, the discovery of these deep reserves, a few kilometers below the surface, and developing technologies that allowed us to drill down and also drill sort of horizontally to tap those reserves by fracturing this rock has been so successful, both in terms of oil and gas in North America, that it's collapsed prices. So commodity prices, natural gas prices, traded, at Henry Hub and in Alberta are at record lows. And if you look in the industry press, companies aren't making very much money. I think a lot of them are just struggling to keep their heads above water. And in fact, you're seeing announcements of write-downs of assets and this sort of thing in the industry. So, really, it's an industry that's not doing well, partly, from its own success, and yet we have a BC government and other governments around North America who are providing these subsidies that are basically bringing much more production into the marketplace than would otherwise be economic given current circumstances. So we are actually contributing to the flooding of the market. And that this will, bite us in the end. All of the idea that there's going to be huge profits from gas development or LNG, and that BC will be able to tax some of that through corporate income tax. I don't think there's going to be any profit to tax at the end of the day, especially once you take into consideration things like, international transfer pricing, where, companies can move their expenses and costs around the world to the most favorable jurisdictions. And I think they basically will minimize their tax liabilities in BC. For LNG, I think there's something else that's going on here. So, the whole, like right now in terms of the straight economics, the cost of getting gas out of the ground, liquefying it and shipping it to Asia is more than the price, the spot price of gas in Asia. So in some sense, it doesn't actually make sense to go ahead with this. But I think what's happening is that in particular with LNG Canada, it's a consortium of the major Asian buyers of gas. So it's, the Chinese government is a big one through PetroChina, Mitsubishi from Japan, Petronas from Malaysia, and Kogas from Korea. So you have all of the major buyers that you want in this consortium, along with Shell, one of the biggest oil and gas companies in the world. So if you're the government of China and you have an opportunity to lock down access to a resource as part of a diversified energy portfolio, which could include nuclear and other gas, including pipeline from Russia, coal, the whole mix of things, and you're essentially being able to get that gas at subsidized prices because the government of British Columbia is ensuring you don't have to pay royalties. It's heavily discounting the cost of the LNG facility. It looks like a pretty good deal. And I think that's what's driving it. It's not the straight up economics, but it's more about energy security as viewed through the lens of Asian governments.
The thing that I always find really bizarre about all this is when you track those same companies that you've mentioned and how much they have made in profits or what they're giving to their shareholders in dividends, that's still fairly significant despite the fact that they're constantly saying that they need subsidies in order to make the projects viable. And so there's just this, there's this massive question, I think, here around who benefits. But one more question to you while I have you, Marc. There's some of the in the chat. There's a question about Site C. So let's just address all the controversial things at once in this webinar, shall we? The question is, if Site C were to be canceled, does that jeopardize existing and new LNG and fossil fuel projects in BC?
Well, I looked at Site C and the overall supply and demand forecast back when it was being reviewed when the NDP government first came into power. And essentially what you had looking forward was a planning surplus, that there was actually more, even before Site C came into the picture, there was more electricity supplied than there was demand. So once you start adding in more and more LNG projects, and the government has, as part of its CleanBC plan, is really to not stop fracking, it's to try to clean up some of the methane emissions that result from fracking through electrification. You add those together, there may well be a case for Site C. But if you actually think about it more from like a managed wind down perspective, which is that by mid-century, we shouldn't be having any oil and gas or coal companies exerting any demand on BC Hydro's grid, we could actually repurpose that existing electricity through our existing hydro system and use it for other things like green manufacturing or electrifying transport or all those sort of things. So that's the kind of mix I think is in play.
Fascinating. Okay, so that actually raises a bunch of questions we've seen in the Q&A around liabilities and around, what is the pathway forward for the BC government? Are there legal liabilities here, et cetera? I'm going to leave that with you, Marc. Vanessa, I expect you've got some answers to that, so you can think about it. But first, I'm going to go back to you, Kai, because the first question, even before anyone started speaking in this webinar, was about Trans Mountain. And the first question to come in was, is that a subsidy? It's taxpayers' money. How much money is at stake? Is it? Can you speak to the economics, Kai, of Trans Mountain and the use of public funds? What are we up to now? Didn't a new report come out today? Is it something like 16 billion? Over to you, Kai.
Thanks. Yeah, so I'm looking at Vanessa here, but I would say the Trans Mountain construction costs are not a traditional subsidy, but they represent a massive chunk of public support to oil and gas producers. And I would say that more than that, Trans Mountain represents a really important and dangerous tipping point. A precedent was set in 2018 when the government bought this troubled project from Kinder Morgan, which was the Texas pipeline company that was pushing the project up until now. And what the government did is it sent the message that if you squeal loud enough, we'll buy you out. Or, if you just don't think you can make the economics work, we'll turn the taps on. And so that has created a wave of announcements from governments, provincial and federal, of additional support to other projects, including the Keystone XL pipeline, which is backstopped by the Alberta government. And we've heard about LNG Canada and the associated pipeline, the Coastal GasLink pipeline here in BC. But the precedent has been set now where the private sector doesn't have to take on the risk of these huge, expensive projects if governments are willing to backstop them or loan them the money or just take them over and build them completely. So Trans Mountain is a really important battle for those reasons. And we are now up to $12.6 billion. That's the estimated construction cost. Of course, these things are never finished on the schedule or the budget they're always over budget and over schedule. And so today, the report that came out was from the Parliamentary Budget Officer that found that basically in all realistic scenarios, this project loses money, whether that's because demand starts to plateau for heavy oil, or because Canada actually continues with modest climate policies that increase the price per barrel for producers. Either way, it's going to lose taxpayers' money. And so the question becomes, why are we doing it? And I think it really does come back to employment. And so the thing that the PBO, the Parliamentary Budget Officer, also pointed out is that, as I said earlier, this is a massive undertaking. Lots of machines, lots of things moving around, lots of economic activity. And so during a pandemic, I think politically, politicians are really clinging to anything that can generate temporary high-paying jobs so that those workers can then go back into their communities and not just spread COVID, but their dollars around, right? Buying Christmas presents and gasoline and going to Tim Hortons and paying their rent or their mortgage or whatever and keeping the economy working. And so this is basically a make-work project. It's a make-work project involving thousands of people, and the PBO estimates that the GDP impact is about 140% of what the government is spending. So if they spend $100 on construction, that translates into 140 bucks in GDP growth because that money changes hands as people go back into their communities and spend their wages. So my question is, why couldn't we take that public money? Like if we're trying to keep people employed and we're trying to generate GDP growth and keep the economy rolling, why do they need to be building a pipeline? I mean, they could very well be digging a hole in the ground and filling it. That would still achieve the purpose of employing people, keeping things in motion, and then, generating economic activity. But much better than that would be building infrastructure that we're actually going to need in 20 years or 30 years. And so that's where I think there's a real need to push politicians on this question of priorities. Because if they're going to spend the money either way, and they're afraid of growing unemployment numbers, they're afraid of the political backlash. And I'm not naive about this. You don't want thousands of out-of-work oil and gas workers. You know, idle hands do the devil's work, and the federal liberals have good reason to fear, you know, a big army of unemployed oil and gas workers. That's not the outcome that we want either, to throw these people out of work. But I think those skill sets are transferable, and if the federal government is paying their paycheck anyway, that there's any number of great projects, and Kirby pointed to many of them, that could generate the same employment, the same returns in terms of GDP growth. In fact, in some instances more. Marc could speak to the difference between investing in renewable energy and oil and gas. But if you put public money into renewable energy, public transit, housing, you're likely to get an even better return. And at the end of the day, you're left with an asset that not only has value, but it's actually useful and helps to reduce emissions instead of increasing them. So I think that's the pressure point that we need to be forcing on our politicians. And there's a few different avenues to do that, but yeah, I'll leave that to some of the other speakers if they have ideas.
Thanks, Guy. I think it's a really good point around, you know, are we building the infrastructure of today? Are we building the infrastructure of tomorrow? You know, when Trans Mountain was first proposed, gosh, 8 years ago now, 9 years ago, the demand for oil that was projected was so much more. You know, it's fallen so much. It's gotten so soft, not just because of COVID, but even before COVID. So the demand projections that were used for the business case, you know, for LNG Canada and for Trans Mountain, are very different today than what the demand projections are today. And you know, the thing that I am worried about is the crash that comes when the demand slows even more and countries start turning away from the highest carbon fossil fuels. Yesterday, I found a tracker on the IEFA website that showed that 50 financial institutions have now said, for example, that they will not finance anything from the oil sands because it's so high carbon. And so, you know, Trans Mountain is to facilitate supposedly growth in the oil sands. So I think, you know, I think what's really clear is the world is changing really quickly. And how do we change our priorities about what kind of infrastructure we build and what kind of infrastructure we support? You know, one more note on the employment question. We've been hearing for a long time that supporting oil and gas expansion is really critical for employment in Canada. Yet, if you look at the numbers that came out recently in the Canadian Energy Regulator report, or prior to that, the David Hughes reports that have been released through CCPA and others, you see that while production is growing, employment is going down. This industry is employing fewer and fewer people. And I keep wondering, so what if we put the 16 billion from Trans Mountain directly to, you know, just transition plans to make sure that no workers and their families are left behind, towards employment opportunities directly in different economies, in different projects? What does that look like? Because it, you know, I worry that what we're actually going to see, no matter what, is a decline in oil and gas markets and production. I mean, that's what we're seeing internationally. And then you just have an unmanaged plan for workers instead of actually creating a plan now. You know, Kirby, let's go back to you, because you had some really good ideas of where the investment could go, where we could see more employment. And I think especially in the North. I mean, let's be clear, this is hard, right? You know, we used to employ a lot more people in logging. We used to employ a lot more people in fishing. And, you know, now people are saying, okay, gas and fossil fuels are going to be the next big thing in the North. So these are serious concerns, because it's not just about how many jobs or what jobs, it's also about where are the jobs. Maybe you could articulate a little bit more some of your ideas of where and how could we see this kind of money repurposed? What are the opportunities for more jobs in the North?
Thanks, Tzeporah. I forgot to mention wind farms, geothermal energy, stuff like that. You know, I think we could spend a lot of this money retraining a lot of our people who are looking for alternative forms of work, training them to install greener energy, and I guess just to make this transition, let's start transitioning into this greener economy that we see many countries around the world transitioning to. I often say, let's do this. Let's not get left behind. It's something that we need to do in order to leave a better quality of life for our descendants, for those yet to come. There are many communities in the north who are looking at geothermal energy. They're looking at wind farms. They're looking at solar panels, and they're just biting at the biscuit, because right now a lot of them are on diesel for energy, and a lot of this diesel is being brought in diesel trucks and in ships, etc. The price of food in the north is just it's outrageous. I was in Kugluktuk, Nunavut about 6 years ago teaching a course. And, a can of pop was $3. A steak was about $60. For a piece of meat was $60. And, I seen a program, I seen some news on the subject a few years ago as well. And they were talking about these dumpster divers. And of course they're dumpster divers, they're starving. So I just want to see this money put into rejuvenating our communities, rejuvenating the local economies, and so that they're sustainable. Thanks, Tzeporah.
Fantastic. Okay, let's go back to the nuts and bolts of how this is done. So we have some really great questions in the Q&A. When companies accumulate royalty credits for future use, first of all, Marc, maybe you can tell us, how do these show up as an asset on their balance sheet? And then related to a larger liability question, if changes to government policy reduce or eliminate their ability to make use of those credits, and it makes it less economical to exploit gas resources in some areas, could the companies sue for compensation because they can't use the credits in the future? Or just, and Vanessa, I'm sure you've done research on this internationally, we're seeing these liability and legal questions come up. And the larger question is, how do we navigate canceling subsidies? Are there fines? Are there payouts? Are there legal challenges? What does that look like for government? So first, Marc, over to you, and then maybe Vanessa.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the specific accounting on corporate balance sheets, I'm not sure. To me, it sounds like it should be something that would be booked as an asset, but I'm not sure. And as I'm an economist, not an accountant, which reminds me of the old joke that an economist is someone who is good with numbers but didn't have the personality to be an accountant. But in terms of, I think, how do we change the regime? I think, as Vanessa pointed out, a lot of these royalty credits have already been granted, so they're kind of sitting in the bank. And I think it would be very difficult to take them away, particularly if you have companies that are making economic decisions and investing, millions of dollars into something to be production predicated on receiving those credits. So I think there would be some sort of compensation that would be required. Similarly, in terms of the leases, so companies bid on the rights to explore and drill, and they pay in some cases historically millions of dollars for these rights. I don't think a government could come and just take those away. So they would need to essentially buy those back. But what we can do is stop the bad stuff going forward. We can stop the royalty credits going forward. We can stop issuing new leases. And as someone pointed out in the chat, that the lifetime of these fracking wells is pretty short. So, the key is to actually sort of not allow new production into the mix. And you may need to let some of the existing leases and production work its way through as part of the transition.
Thanks,
Vanessa, do you want to add? Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Tzeporah. Yeah, in terms of the legal issues, I definitely am not a lawyer, and so I don't know what the legal ramifications would be if BC or any other jurisdiction, for that matter, decided to eliminate its credits and try to have that apply retroactively. I suspect politically it wouldn't happen. I think that there's a lot of pressure to keep those, so you know, we have this, as I mentioned, this 2.6 billion in outstanding credits that we're sort of locked into at this point, which is why it makes it ever so important that we actually work to adjust that royalty framework sooner rather than later, so we stop accumulating those credits now. And that's why it was encouraging to see the BC NDP in their election campaign discuss the oil and gas royalty framework. And I think that there is a big opportunity, and it's one of the reasons we decided to have this webinar, to build up some public support and pressure to encourage the government to actually review that framework sooner rather than later, and to ensure that that review, environmental issues and social issues are foregrounded when they look at that framework. So I think, you know, it's important to remember that many of these subsidies have been in place for decades and were introduced at a time when we either didn't have a good understanding of climate change. Some of them go back to like the 1950s, 1960s, when that just environmental issues were just not as foregrounded in the social mind. And it's been a long time that they've been in place, and no one's kind of really questioned them. And now they're starting to be questioned, and we need to keep building that momentum to actually kind of work to undo and to change some of those policies.
Super helpful. And I know that there is actually a research group internationally that's looking at some of these legal issues now. I think Center for Investigative Environmental Law, Carol Muffett is doing some work on this, as well as the Third World Network. So I think there's a lot of people asking these same questions because of the kind of, I would say, for a lot of countries, new understanding about the production gap, that we not only need to reduce emissions, but if we're actually going to, and you know, this webinar is during the week of the 5th anniversary of Paris. If we're actually going to meet Paris climate goals, then we also have to stop the expansion of production of oil, gas, and coal. And that is going to raise a lot of significant issues internationally around both legal issues and liabilities, but also trade and debt. You know, a lot of the countries that I'm working with right now are planning to expand, or where I'm working are planning to expand production just to feed debt. And so those are huge issues that need to be addressed. And when I started working on these issues, I was pretty surprised to find out that there aren't a lot of mechanisms to address fossil fuel production within the Paris Accord. And in fact, the words oil, gas, or coal don't even exist in the Paris Accord, which was interesting to find out. So a little plug, if people are interested, I chair now the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative, which is a global initiative that can be found at fossilfueltreaty.org, of lawyers and diplomats, academics, and advocates from around the world coming together to call on governments to create a fossil fuel treaty to address some of these exact same issues. Okay, so we are almost at the end of our webinar. I'm going to take just one or two more questions, and then we're going to go to all of our amazing speakers for some final words. I think some of the questions that we're seeing come up in the Q&A are related, in fact, because they're these questions about, I don't understand why this is happening, and what are the political strategies that work to make it not happening? How do we engage more people in this issue? How do we talk about these issues so that there's more traction? I've been working on climate change now for almost 2 decades, and this question of fossil fuel subsidies has been a huge question, you know, for years and years and years. I will say that one of my favorite campaigns was in Australia from the Australian Institute, because they built coalition with other segments of society that were looking and needing government support, financial support, hospital workers, teachers, etc. And they did great ad campaigns. We've seen similar ones in Canada, actually, from Environmental Defense, where they compared the amount spent on fossil fuels to how many hospital beds this would be, how many people employed, you know, for retraining this would be, how many more teachers could be funded. So I think, making it real to people is important, but I want to turn it over to you on the panel if you want to reflect at all on either why this is happening or what are the most effective strategies and how do we talk about these issues in order to gain more traction and solutions. I'm looking for hands up from the panel. Who wants to start? Kai, please.
Well, I have a little anecdote from a few years ago when one of the big Petronas LNG projects was proposed up here, and my friend Shannon McPhail got a visitor at her office at Skeena Watershed Conservation Coalition in Hazelton from someone who was really upset about this person, Ellen G. Her last initial was G, and she was causing a whole bunch of trouble around, and this person had heard a lot about it and wanted to know what they could do to help. And it was a reminder that, like, for most people, these acronyms and these technical terms that we use don't mean anything at all. And if they do mean something, they are generally something positive, because the industry has, like, focus grouped and tested their language, spent millions of dollars on communications consultants to make sure that when people think LNG, they think about solving climate change or good jobs or other positive associations. And so, as a basic step in sort of winning the overall political battle, I think we need to think hard about how we communicate, how we talk about these issues with British Columbians, because we know that they're on board. We know that people's values are in the right place. But somewhere along the way, they've had the wool pulled over their eyes by Christy Clark and the fracking industry. And so terms like LNG or liquefied natural gas, I would say we should try to banish from our vocabulary. I mean, what we're talking about is fracking subsidies. We're talking about foreign companies taking government money to increase fracking. And we know that if you talk about it in those terms, that a large majority of the BC public is opposed. But if you say, oh, we're going to build these LNG facilities to provide clean natural gas to economies in Asia to help them with the transition off of coal, well, of course, the majority of people support them. So how we communicate these issues is super important. And I understand that there's an issue around the precision of the term subsidies. But that's okay. I think we can leave the term subsidies to the WTO and to policy analysts, because the word subsidies doesn't actually work very well when talking to average people either. I think we need to talk about what they need in their lives, what's at stake, why they can't have that, because the government's giving our tax dollars to these foreign fracking companies. And so we've found some success in starting to reframe the conversation along those lines. I'd be curious to hear from other people what works when you're having those conversations with people who aren't steeped in this stuff day to day.
Others from our panel? Yeah, Vanessa.
Thanks, Kai. Those are really, really useful thoughts, especially about the word subsidy. You know, I think sometimes it's hard for us as researchers to kind of think about, like, what the level of literacy on these kind of technical issues is by the general public. And, you know, 5 years ago, when I wasn't really working on climate change issues, I had no idea what a subsidy was. So I think it's important to remember that and to use plain language when we're trying to explain these issues to the general public and get buy-in. But also when we work with policymakers, that's where we need to have nuance and have strong understanding to be able to push policymakers in the right direction. You know, I was going to say also, IISD, our primary audience and who we work with primarily are governments, and then groups like Dogwood and Stand.earth and some of the other organizations on this panel. They're working to galvanize public support, and we need those groups to be working in tandem so that we can be pushing from different sides to get where we need to be. And as you mentioned, Tzeporah, also creating coalitions with other groups as well. And I think we've seen that such inspirational work being done with the Just Recovery for All movement in Canada, where we've had so many organizations sign on to principles for a just recovery from labor, from health, from environment, from faith groups to migrant rights groups. And I think we need to work to kind of create the same kind of momentum on climate change policy and on eliminating support for fossils, because it's about the same issues, right? It's about people's lives and their well-being being at stake now and in the future. And we need to be able to support workers and support communities by working together and by thinking outside the box.
Thank you, Vanessa. Those are really great points. I would only add, there's some questions about what people can do during COVID. I can't underscore more how important it is for you to contact your elected decision makers, your MLAs, your MPs, and encourage your family and friends to do it as well. They need to hear from you, whether it's a quick email or a call. Ask for a meeting of your local MLA. Let's remember they work for us. And you don't have to be an expert. You just have to know where you want your tax dollars to go. Do you want it to go to the oil and gas companies directly? Do you want it to go to some of these solutions? Let them know. Let them know that you prioritize action on climate change and Indigenous rights. Our decision makers need to hear from us. And when they do, they assume that more people are also thinking about it. So let's keep this issue at the top of their minds. We are almost out of time. So I am going to turn to our panel now, starting with you, Kirby, for any last words for the well over 200 people that have joined us today.
Thank you for this opportunity, Tzeporah, and thank you to the great panel for all your wise words. I'd just like to echo some of the things I've heard today. I urge everybody to take this very serious issue up with your elected representatives. Let them know that you know about this. Let them know that you're very disappointed as to where our tax dollars are being spent. And as Tzeporah said, it's our money. It's our money. And it just blows me away that we're basically giving away our resources. We're paying these companies to take them with these subsidies. And more often than none, we're left with the cleanup. So make your voice heard. Tell your friends, tell your family, inform yourselves, and really make sure that your elected leaders know that you're disappointed in this. Thank you, Tzeporah.
Thanks, Kirby. Marc, over to you.
Yeah, I wanted to pick up on something Kai was talking about in terms of the language we use. I mean, it seems to me that the term natural gas is like the biggest PR coup in the history of fossil fuels. We've tried calling it fracked gas. It's methane, that's what it is. And methane certainly doesn't sound very attractive, but sometimes it seems like it's hard to argue against natural gas, and it makes it easy for the proponents to make it seem like part of clean energy, a solution. And often it is conflated in those conversations. In terms of where we go, I think it's got to be some sort of coalition with environmentalists, First Nations, and other constituencies, whether those are fishers or farmers who have an interest in this. I think if it's just environmental groups alone, it's not enough. And sometimes we need to better make the linkages amongst each other. We have good news. In BC, we have a huge history of protests, going back in my memory to Clackwood Sound. When I first moved here, Enbridge pipeline struck a huge chord when it was put on the table, in 2012. And just before COVID hit, we had these massive Indigenous-led protests across the country, sparked around the Coastal GasLink pipeline, which is the pipeline connecting the fracking fields in the Northeast to LNG in the Northwest. But I feel like that protest, it was rightly about Indigenous rights, but I think there was maybe a failure to make the connection back to the resource development and LNG as well. So maybe there's a bit of a lost opportunity to work with those, but some kind of broader coalition I think is necessary, and politicians listen when there are bodies in the streets.
Thanks, Marc. Kai.
Thanks. Yeah, I'd like to pick up Marc's point about the coalition, and I don't think we can forget about the workers or the unions that they belong to. And so, when I look across the landscape right now in northern BC, these companies they're building fortresses, right? We think of, we say man camp, and I don't know, maybe you picture like canvas tents in the gold rush, but these are basically like hotels in the bush. And for a lot of people, they're more comfortable than the home that they have to go back to. They feed you really, really well. They pay your mileage, and they pay you a good paycheck for as long as that job lasts, to drive a truck or to man a security booth or to cook or to run an excavator or whatever that is. And so they provide, in real terms, they provide security to people who are facing an increasingly uncertain world. And so it's not surprising at all to me that people feel loyal to their employers in that context, because that's where their security and peace of mind and their paycheck comes from. And so I think that, I mean, we know that those workers are totally expendable to the companies. The companies are trying to figure out ways to make more money with fewer workers, actually, by automating them out of jobs and by moving production offshore if they can. But I think that there's a vital role for the workers themselves to articulate what it is that they want for their communities and what they want to do with their skills. And if we don't have workers as part of that conversation, it's going to be difficult, because we end up in this jobs versus environment frame. And we're going to lose that argument. If it's jobs versus the environment, well, the environment starts to feel pretty expendable to politicians and policymakers when you're trying to keep employment numbers up in a recession, and you've got some deadly virus rampaging across the province. So I think that as the world gets more and more uncertain, and especially as we head into a prolonged economic recession, we need to figure out how to get workers as part of that coalition and articulating the vision that they have for their own families and for their communities.
Thank you so much, Kai. Vanessa, any
Thanks.
final words?
Yeah, I don't have too much to add. I think it's been articulated beautifully by the other panelists, and I'm so happy to see so much interest in this topic and all the questions we've had, much higher than we thought we would for this webinar. So it's really encouraging, and I can see there is momentum out there, and we just need to keep building it. I think what Kai said is absolutely right. When we are talking about transitioning and when we're talking about phasing out fossil fuel subsidies, we have to remember that there are impacts to that as well. And so we need to manage those impacts, and absolutely, as at the same time that we're pushing for the governments to eliminate fossil fuel subsidies and invest in better industries that are going to help us thrive in a low carbon future, we also need to ask governments to support a just transition and to set up processes that allow workers and communities to have a say in the development that's happening in their own communities, to be able to provide workers supports as they transition, to be able to create good quality, attractive jobs in alternative economies. So this is, these things have to happen hand in hand, and we can't have one without the other. And I think that given the enthusiasm for this, it only seems to be growing. I try to stay optimistic that we can get there someday, but it means we have to do a lot of hard work ahead of us.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And thank you so much to IISD and the other organizations who have put together this tremendous webinar. I want to leave with a little notion of hope. I don't know if folks saw it this week, but Denmark this week became the first major producer in the world to announce that they are stopping the expansion of oil and gas, and they're going to wind down oil and gas production by 2050 to be in line with climate goals. This is the kind of leadership, certainly many will say it's not fast enough to achieve 1.5. That's probably true. We need even more. We need this kind of leadership from countries and from provinces if we're going to ensure a livable climate in the future. And so if there are folks from the provincial government or from the federal government listening to this webinar, I want to leave you with one clear message: walk it back. We didn't know when you planned these projects, or even for some of you when you planned your budgets, what we know today. Our world is changing very quickly. And on this one, you're on the wrong side of history. So what we need now is evidence-based leadership. We need policy and our money going into solutions to wind down fossil fuel production and emissions. And we need a plan for workers and their families and the infrastructure for tomorrow. It's not easy. It's going to take courage from you and from all of us. But the great thing about courage is contagious. And that's what we need right now. Thank you all for joining us today for this webinar. The recording will come out soon. Please share it with your friends.